Hello everybody. Today we are going to continue our series of applied neuroanatomy, and we are going to discuss the anatomy of the cerebellum and the cerebellar pathways. The anatomy I don't like is when it is such complex anatomy, full of nomenclature, but this is to show you that this is the real anatomy. This is the truth about how complex are the neural structures and the neural connections, but we are going to try to simplify these structures as much as we can and to stress on structures having clinical implications and surgical application. To simplify matters, you have to remember always the rule of three when you talk about the cerebellum. You see that the cerebellum has three surfaces. According to the structure it faces, the tentorial surface, which is facing the undersurface of the tent, the suboccipital surface, which is facing the convexity dura, and you see it after doing the suboccipital craniectomy, and the petrosal surface, which is facing the petrous bone. You see it when you retract the cerebellum medially, when you try to expose, for instance, cerebellum pontine angle, acoustic neuroma, and sometimes cases of trigeminal neuralgia. The cerebellum has three peduncles: the inferior cerebellar peduncle, middle cerebellar peduncle, and superior cerebellar peduncle, from the medulla, from the pons, and from the midbrain. The cerebellar cortex has three layers: the molecular layer, Purkinje layer, and granular layer. The cerebellum receives three types of afferents. The afferents giving information to the cerebellum. It gathers information from different parts of the central nervous system, which are concerned with the equilibrium, with the tone, and with the fine movement. So it gathers afferents from the vestibular apparatus, as we'll see, concerned with equilibrium, from the proprioception for the muscle tone, and from the extrapyramidal and the pyramidal, the motor. The motor is either extrapyramidal, olivocerebellar tract from the inferior olive, or pyramidal from the transverse pontine fibers. The cerebellum has one main efferent, some other efferents, but there is one main efferent, and this main efferent stops in three stations: the red nucleus, the thalamus, and the frontal lobe. Also, the cerebellum is supplied by three cerebellar arteries: the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, branch from the vertebral, the ICA, or the anterior inferior cerebellar artery, from the basilar, and the superior cerebellar artery from the basilar. The cerebellum has three nuclei. Central, in the parenchyma of the cerebellum, there is the dentate nucleus, which is the most important and which is the biggest and which is the cornerstone in many of the cerebellar connections. We have the nucleus intermedius and the fastigial nucleus. This is a gross anatomy of the cerebellum. This is an anterior view after removing the brainstem. The middle cerebellar peduncle. You see the verms, you see the lateral cerebellar hemispheres, and you see the structures, which are some fissures dividing the cerebellar hemisphere into lobules and the verms into different parts. And this is the posterior view showing the fissures, the transverse fissure, horizontal fissure, and many other fissures, as you'll see, and different parts of the clivus. This is a real view, anatomical view of the cerebellum after suboccipital approach and removing the dura. This is the transverse sinus to show you the arterial supply and the venous drainage of the cerebellum. And this is a magnified view showing the pica arising from the vertebral artery and supplying the posterior inferior surface of the cerebellum. This is the inferior surface of the cerebellum. If you look to the cerebellum from below, you will find that cerebellum is divided into three main important lobes, which are different in function, and they are different in evolution and development. We have, from this surface, we can see the anterior lobe, we can see the flocculonodular lobe, and you can see the posterior lobe. Here is the anterior lobe, the posterior lobe, and the flocculonodular lobe. And this is another view of the cerebellum, showing the two hemispheres and showing the primary fissure separating the anterior lobe from the posterior lobe of the cerebellar hemisphere, which contains the horizontal fissure. This is an internal structure of the cerebellum, showing, as we said, the biggest and the most important and the cornerstone nucleus in cerebellar connections, which is the dentate nucleus. Medial to the dentate nucleus, there are two small nuclei, which are the emboliform and the globose. They call it the nucleus intermedius. We can call it one nucleus, so the dentate nucleus, nucleus intermedius, and the fastigial nucleus. This is a division of the cerebellum into three main important parts, because they are different in evolution, different in connections, and they are different in functions. So we have one part is the flocculonodular lobe, which is the archicerebellum, the oldest part of the cerebellum. It is present in fish, and it is responsible for the equilibrium, and the main connection is with the vestibular nuclei. And the anterior lobe, which is concerned with the tone. Concerned with the tone, it receives sensation or information from the proprioceptive sensations, and it is well developed in birds, and it is called the paliocerebellum. So this is the archi, this is the palio, and the third one is the most recent cerebellum, what we call the neurocerebellum, which is responsible for the harmonization of movement and the adjustment of the movements and the fine motions. It adjusts and refines the pyramidal and extrapyramidal motions. And in each of the lobes you can see the distribution of the parts of the body, here for the lower limb tone, upper limb tone, and here for the smoothness of the movement, and this is the archicerebellum. This is a lateral view of the brainstem, where you can see the cerebellar peduncles. The most important and the biggest and the most superficial is the middle cerebellar peduncle, from the lateral pons to the cerebellum, hiding medial to it two less smaller connections, the inferior cerebellar peduncle, what we call the restiform body. Here is the middle cerebellar peduncle connecting the pons, call it the brachium pontis, and the superior cerebellar peduncle connecting the cerebellum with the midbrain, called brachium conjunctiva. So inferior, middle, superior. So the brachium, the restiform body, as we see, the restiform body, the brachium pontis, and the brachium conjunctiva, the inferior, the middle, and superior cerebellar peduncles. This is a view after removing the middle cerebellar peduncle. When you look to the surface of the lateral brainstem, actually you cannot see the inferior or the superior cerebellar peduncles, because they are hidden by the most lateral and the biggest middle cerebellar peduncle. After removing the middle cerebellar peduncle, you can see the inferior cerebellar peduncle, restiform body, connecting the medulla with the cerebellum, and the superior cerebellar peduncle, the brachium conjunctivum, connecting the cerebellum with the midbrain. The blood supply of the cerebellum is simple. It is supplied by the superior cerebellar artery, supplying the superior surface of the cerebellum, and it is arising from the basilar artery before the bifurcation, and the ICA, anterior inferior cerebellar artery. From its name, it supplies the anterior part of the inferior surface of the cerebellum. It also arises from the proximal part of the basilar artery, and also the ICA gives a very important branch, the internal auditory artery, which supplies the acousticofacial bundle responsible for hearing and motion of the face, the seventh and the eighth cranial nerves. And the third one is the pica, posterior inferior cerebellar artery, which is arising usually from the vertebral artery after piercing the dura before joining the other vertebral artery lateral to the brainstem and supplying the posterior part of the inferior surface of the cerebellum. When we talk about the venous drainage, the most important veins of surgical importance is the precentral cerebellar vein. This is superior vermian vein, the precentral cerebellar vein, and laterally there is the petrosal vein. The importance of the precentral cerebellar vein or superior vermian vein is that it drains into the great cerebral vein of Galen. So when you are having a supracerebellar infratentorial approach to the pineal region, you can reach the great cerebral vein of Galen where it is by following the precentral cerebellar veins, which you can sacrifice. If you go laterally, you will find in 2/3 of the distance from the surface of the cerebellum to the trigeminal, another vein on the surface of the cerebellum. It is usually an inverted Y-shaped vein. It is called the petrosal vein. It is draining into the superior petrosal sinus. So the trigeminal route, when you're doing trigeminal neuralgia, through the supracerebellar infratentorial approach, you find this in your way, and you find the trigeminal route anterior, always anterior to this petrosal vein. In 99% of the cases, you can sacrifice the petrosal vein without problems, but sometimes it can cause a disaster. In 1% of the cases, sharing the blood supply of the brainstem with it, the lateral pontomesencephalic vein, and in this case, you can get a hazardous problem of brainstem edema. But as we said, it doesn't represent more than 1%. And this is a magnified view of the petrosal vein. As we said, it is an inverted Y. These are the limbs, and it is draining into superior petrosal sinus, and it is right in front, facing us from posterior. It is right posterior to the trigeminal root. So to reach the trigeminal root, you can find the petrosal vein, and when you coagulate it, you find the trigeminal root in front of it. If it is long enough, you can save it, and you can work to decompress the trigeminal from superior cerebellar loop, for instance, by putting your piece of Teflon here. This is another view of the cerebellar veins. This is the precentral cerebellar vein, as we said, superior vermian vein, precentral cerebellar vein, and this is the lateral venous drainage of the brainstem. This is a view. If you do the supracerebellar infratentorial approach, you will reach such region in the pineal region, where you can find the two major veins, the internal cerebral and interior cerebral. We'll discuss this with the venous system, uniting together, forming the great cerebral vein of Galen, and the internal cerebral vein receive the internal occipital vein, and the most important, the basal vein of Rosenthal, and the basal vein of Rosenthal of the other side. You should remember this when we'll come to it. The cerebellar cortex, as we said, as the rule of three, we said that it is formed by three layers: the molecular layer, the Purkinje layer, and the granular layer. Not to forget, this is the Purkinje cell, and you will see a very nice view. Start by the Purkinje layer. It contains the Purkinje cells. The Purkinje cells are very important cells because they transmit information from the cerebellar cortex to the cerebellar nuclei, mainly the dentate nucleus. So the Purkinje layer is the layer in the middle. The molecular layer contains the dendrites of the cell. Purkinje cell is present in the Purkinje layer. The molecular layer contains the dendrites of the Purkinje cells, and the granular layer contains the axons of the Purkinje cells going on their way to the dentate nucleus, and it contains also some granule cells and Golgi cells, and from this granule cells the name was derived. The granule cells have also axons going to the nuclei and called Mosi fiber. So we have the Purkinje layer containing Purkinje cells, dendrites of the Purkinje cells, the molecular layer, axons of the Purkinje cells in the granular layer with the granule cells. The cerebellar connections, we should know before talking about the connections, what are the functions of the cerebellum. The cerebellum, as we said, is divided into several parts. The equilibrium is one of the most important functions of the cerebellum, and it is a function of the archicerebellum. As we said, it is present in fish. The muscle tone and posture, it is the connection with the extrapyramidal and called the paliocerebellum, and refining pyramidal motion. Pyramidal and extrapyramidal motion, without the cerebellum, they are coarse, they are not refined, there is dysmetria, there is tremors, kinetic tremors, and to harmonize and refine the motion, smooth and precise, we have connection with the Pontine nuclei called the neocerebellum. So we have equilibrium, muscle tone and posture, and the refining the motion of the cerebellum, the pyramidal and extrapyramidal tract, which is the function of the neocerebellum. Outputs from the cerebellum, as we said, there is one main output from the cerebellum and some less important outputs. So let's see here. The most important output, you remember, we called it before, if you remember other lectures in the concerned about the thalamus or the extrapyramidal system, we said the dentato from the dentate nucleus, rubro, red nucleus, thalamo, which is the anterior ventral nucleus of the thalamus, cortical pathway, which is the pyramidal and the extrapyramidal part of the motor cortex. And this is the main output from the cerebellum. Forget about the other nuclei, from the dentate nucleus to the red nucleus to the thalamus and to the motor cortex. But also the cerebellum gives an output to the vestibular nuclei so they can reach the spinal cord via the vestibulospinal fibers. Also to the reticular nuclei reaching the spinal cord by the reticulospinal fibers. And also the red nucleus reaching the spinal cord by the rubrospinal fiber. So these are important connections so that through these nuclei the cerebellum can control the motor function of the body. But if you have to say one efferent from the cerebellum, it is the efferent from the dentate nucleus to the red nucleus, from the red nucleus to the thalamus, and from the thalamus to the motor cortex, as you will see now. The cerebellar afferents will start. All the cerebellar afferents are from the medulla via the inferior cerebellar peduncle and the pons via the middle cerebellar peduncle. So globally speaking, the afferents to the cerebellum are from the inferior cerebellar peduncle and the middle cerebellar peduncle. This means what? This means that the efferent is through the superior cerebellar peduncle. Now we are talking about the afferents. Forget about the superior cerebellar peduncle. We talk about afferents from the medulla, inferior cerebellar peduncle, and from the pons, middle cerebellar peduncle. The afferents from the medulla they go through the inferior cerebellar peduncle or the restiform body. What kind of information are given from the medulla? Proprioception, the deep sensation, and from the inferior olive, which is the extrapyramidal information from the extrapyramidal system, and from the vestibular nuclei, it contains information from the vestibular nuclei, which are the center of equilibrium, because they receive impulses from the vestibular nerve, and it receives from the semicircular canals, utricle and saccule, which are the structures or sensors or the receptors for equilibrium. So the three main functions of the cerebellum as we said, and these are the afferents from the medulla, proprioception, inferior olive, and vestibular nuclei. All these afferents from the cerebellum, all of them relay in the cerebellar cortex. Where? In the Purkinje fibers, as we said. Also, all the Purkinje cells transmit to the dentate nucleus. So the medulla gives us afferents for proprioception, for extrapyramidal, and for equilibrium. Proprioception, as we will see now, and from the what we call the dorsal spinocerebellar tract and the coniocerebellar tract, as you will see. We'll discuss all the details, but now you should know that all the afferents from the medulla reach the cerebellar cortex and relay with the Purkinje cells, and all the afferents from the Purkinje cells go to the dentate nucleus of the cerebellum. So we can say that the Purkinje cells are the golden gate to the cerebellum. All afferents relay in the Purkinje cells, and the dentate nucleus is the golden gate from the cerebellum. So the fibers of the Purkinje cells relay with the dentate nucleus, which gives rise to the efferents from the cerebellum. The proprioception will discuss the afferents from the medulla, as we said. From where is coming the proprioception? Proprioception means the deep sensation, the sense of position, the sense of passive movement, the muscle sense, and the joint sense. This is very important. The posterior spinocerebellar tract, it is a very well-developed tract, taking the deep sensation from the lower limb, going to the cerebellum, and the coniocerebellar tract from the upper limb, going to the cerebellum. Why? The cerebellum, its function, as we said, it has to maintain the muscle tone, it has to maintain the equilibrium, and it has to maintain the smooth, gentle, refined motion. So how can he do this motion without receiving information from the different parts of the body? So to adjust the position in space, to adjust the equilibrium of the body, we have to receive an information about the sense of position, about the deep sensation from the body, continuous information to the cerebellum, so he can adjust the equilibrium according to the information he's getting. That's why the cerebellum has to receive deep sensation from the lower limb, from the upper limb. And this is to show you the dorsal or posterior spinocerebellar tract goes to the cerebellum through the inferior cerebellar peduncle, what we call the restiform body, and then it goes to the surface of the cerebellum, Purkinje cells. Then from the Purkinje cells, it goes to the dentate nucleus, and the dentate nucleus give the cerebellar efferent. You see that the information come from one side, they go to the other side of the cerebellar cortex. And then when it goes from the cerebellar cortex, Purkinje fibers, to the dentate nucleus, they cross another cross going to the red nucleus. So there is a double crossing from information from the medulla to the cerebellar cortex, and another crossing from the dentate nucleus to the red nucleus. That's why any cerebellar lesion causes ipsilateral affection, ipsilateral ataxia, because there is a double crossing. It doesn't cause contralateral, because it's crossing twice, so any lesion in the cerebellum produces a lesion on the same side. And this is another nice view showing cross-section. As we said, the most superficial and the biggest is the middle cerebellar peduncle, and medial to it is the superior cerebellar peduncle and the inferior cerebellar peduncle. And this is to show you how the proprioception reaches the cerebellum from the inferior cerebellar peduncle and from the striamedullaris thalami. These are the striamedullaris thalami, what we call the external arcuate fibers, also reach the cerebellum, taking information from the dorsal spinocerebellar tract, cuneo-cerebellar tract, giving the information about the deep sensation to the cerebellum from the external arcuate fibers. And this is the cut section of the dorsal spinal cord structure, and you can see that the deep sensation, and this is the posterior spinocerebellar tract, taking sensation from the lower limb, giving information. And in these cases, if you are going to do a drysotomy, selective dorsal root entry zone lesion, you might go a bit lateral, you might injure the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. In this case, the patient will get ipsilateral ataxia. The olivocerebellar tract, the inferior olive, is a very important structure. It is a very important structure in the extrapyramidal system, and it gives fibers from the inferior olive, from the extrapyramidal system, giving information to the cerebellum. So, afferents from the extrapyramidal system, the inferior olive is telling the cerebellum, take care, the extrapyramidal system is carrying impulses. Why? Because we have to regulate the posture and the tone. So always afferents from the inferior olivocerebellar tract through the inferior cerebellar peduncle, or what we call the restiform body. Afferents from the vestibular nuclei are through the juxta-restiform body. It is a very small structure. You can consider it restiform body, but a small bundle separate from the restiform body, separate from the inferior cerebellar peduncle, carrying information from the vestibular nuclei. Again, not to lose your track, we are talking about afferents to the cerebellum from the medulla. And we said that the afferents from the cerebellum from the medulla are deep sensation, as we said, going through the inferior cerebellar peduncle and external arcuate fibers, and the vestibular nuclei through the juxta-restiform body, and the proprioception from the dorsal spinocerebellar and the cuneo-cerebellar tracts. And this is, if you want to see, this is the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and this is the juxta-restiform body and juxta-restiform body. Now we finished the afferents from the medulla. We are going now to discuss the afferents from the pons. Afferents from the pons, the middle cerebellar peduncle, what we call the brachial pons, are through the transverse pontine fibers to the middle cerebellar peduncle to the cortex. Why? As you see here, we have the pons, we have anterior pons, we have the pontine nuclei and the transverse pontine fibers. As you will see it now, the transverse pontine fibers form the middle cerebellar peduncle, which goes to the cerebellar cortex and the golden rule, as we said, relaying with the Purkinje fibers, then the Purkinje fibers sending axons to the dentate nucleus to continue the circuit. So this is a transverse section of the pons, and here you can see the pontine nuclei. Actually, they are not true nuclei, they are the pyramidal tracts. They are coming from the cerebral peduncle and going to form the pyramid. So we call them the pontine, they form the middle cerebellar peduncle or transverse pontine fibers. And this is the main, the efferents from the cerebellum. These are the afferents. So the afferents from the medulla, the afferents from the pons, through the middle cerebellar peduncle, from the pontine nuclei, and the main cerebellar efferents are to the midbrain via superior cerebellar peduncle. So it's not wrong if you say that afferents are coming from the inferior and middle cerebellar peduncle, and the efferent is through the superior cerebellar peduncle. The superior cerebellar peduncle are involved in one circuit. You should always remember this circuit because you will find it in different structures of the central nervous system: the dentato, rubro, thalamo-fronto-ponto-cerebellar pathway. The dentate nucleus to the red nucleus in the midbrain through the superior cerebellar peduncle, to the anterior ventral nucleus of the thalamus, to the frontal lobe, the pyramidal and the extrapyramidal. Why the pyramidal? To refine the movement of the pyramidal, and why from the extrapyramidal also? To have an idea about the muscle tone. And then the fibers will go down from the frontal lobe, from the motor and premotor area, down to the pons, and from the pons through the middle cerebellar peduncle, they go to the surface of the cerebellum. So the dentato rubro, they leave the cerebellum via the superior cerebellar peduncle, and the pontocerebellar, they reach the cerebellum via the middle cerebellar peduncle. So the middle cerebellar peduncle is carrying the afferent to the cerebellum, and the superior cerebellar peduncle is carrying the efferent from the cerebellum to the red nucleus. The double crossing with the cerebellum, as we said, causes ipsilateral ataxia. And we'll see it here. Let's follow this tract. We have the dentate nucleus. The dentate nucleus sends fibers to the red nucleus. Dentato rubro, crossing to the other side. Rubro, thalamo, anterior ventral nucleus of the thalamus. Fronto, the pyramidal, extrapyramidal parts. Then going again, ponto, and through the middle cerebellar peduncle, it goes to the surface of the cerebellum, and back again to the dentate nucleus. So the dentato, rubro, thalamo, fronto, ponto, middle cerebellar pathway, it goes to the surface of the cerebellum, and it relays again in the dentate nucleus. Again, this is a more refined view. As we said, the afferents always come to the Purkinje fibers. Purkinje cells relate to the dentate cells. The efferent comes from the dentate nucleus, crossing to the other side, and then reaching the thalamus. What part of the thalamus? The anterior ventral nucleus of the thalamus, and then going to the frontal cortex, and going down from the frontal cortex to the middle cerebellar peduncle, and again to the cerebellar cortex. You will see there is a crossing here and another crossing pyramidal, so cerebellar lesions cause ipsilateral weakness. And from that, you should know that the main concern of the cerebellum is the balance. We are using the balance in every step in our life, and the cerebellum helps provide smooth, coordinated body movement. So the cerebellum, again, is concerned with three main functions: with the balance and equilibrium, with the muscle tone, and refining movement. Thank you.